let's start. I think let's have maybe a few people join us a bit later. But for the meantime, I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar series. This is the second episode, which is about integrating stakeholder engagement and computer modeling in Foresight processes. And I'm very glad that we have a very interesting group of speakers with us today. And I think we can say that these are, leading experts and senior researchers in this field. And I think we're going to learn a lot from this discussion. I think there's a lot of interesting things that we want to explore and also keep exploring as we move forward with the Foresight for Food System Transformation agenda. So let me give a first introduction very briefly. My name is Brian Peters, and I'm the facilitator for this Foresight for Food network. And please note that this session is being recorded, so it can later be reviewed back after the session. So just briefly about Foresight for Food. We're a network of providers and users of foresight and scenario analysis. It's about promoting futures thinking for food system transformation, trying to take a long-term perspective into the future, how that means and what different pathways there might be towards that transformation. We build capacities, especially on foresight related to the topic of food systems. And of course, we link participatory processes and data modeling. And that's exactly what we're about here today. So I hope to have an interesting discussion on some of those challenges, opportunities, and tensions that we see there. This webinar series is part of a trajectory that we've initiated this year. So we've had our first series a few weeks ago, this is the second one, and we intend to organize another one by the end of March. So keep an eye on us, watch this space for new opportunities and new ideas. But we want to use this space to engage with each other, to talk about what we're doing, but also to learn from each other, explore different methods, look at the emerging big trends, drivers, and uncertainties that are shaping our food system nowadays. And it's very demand driven. So we're very open to having your input, your ideas, your suggestions for topics, and also your participation perhaps as a speaker or panelist. So feel very welcome to join. Today's agenda, we've got about 1 hour and 15 minutes planned for this today. So I hope you'll be able to join us until the very end. The agenda is basically this introduction, and then I'll give the word to Jim Woodhill, who is the lead for the Foresight for Food initiative, to give a bit of setting of the scenes. Why are we coming up with this topic? Why is it relevant to have this discussion? And basically take from there a panel discussion and some brief presentations from Keith Wiebe, who is Senior Research Fellow at International Food Policy Research Institute, and Said Moghayr, who is Senior Researcher at Wageningen Economic Research at the Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands. We expected to also have Mario Herrera with us here today. I hope he'll still be able to join, but I think he's been inconvenienced. And I've been very happy to ask my colleague, Monica Zurek, from the University of Oxford, to Environmental Change Group, to step in and also offer some reflections, perhaps a bit more on the qualitative side. So thanks so much for that, Monica. After these discussions, we'll have interactive breakouts. So that'll be a chance for you to also not only engage with us, with the speakers, but also with each other about what you've just heard and about what you think is relevant with regard to this topic. We'll come back together and also share a very brief feedback of what we learned to the group, and then we'll close with a sort of perspective on where we want to go from here. So without further ado, can I ask Jim, can you please take us through the setting of the scene?
Oh, okay. That's interesting. I think our files haven't synced, but never mind. I'll jump in from what we've got. Look, thanks very much. Great to have everybody joining us again. I'm speaking here from Kenya, where we've been actually having a really fascinating discussion today around the whole issue of food systems change and foresight thinking with a group of stakeholders from across government, private sector, farmers, research groups. And of course, that's happening here in the context of the tremendous drought that's really devastating significant parts of Kenya. And also a context where food prices are just gone up incredibly, and a large part of the proportion of the population just actually can't afford to eat a healthy diet. And I think part of the discussion we were having today was, of course, there's a tremendous need to cope with those immediate pressures, but how do we start thinking about the future in a way that we can perhaps understand these coming pressures on the food system a little bit more ahead of time, build in resilience to those pressures, and do a bit more of the forward thinking. And in the workshop we've been having here in Kenya today, I think the need for doing that was very, very clearly expressed. So that's I think what we're really talking about today is how do we understand what's coming down the pipeline in terms of some of the pressures and issues for the food system. And in doing that, we want to make the best use of data and information we can, work out how to really bring different stakeholders into that discussion. So, I mean, just to kick off the discussion here, I've sort of put these few ideas of, how do we go from data through modeling, data visualization, sense making to ultimately the understanding, commitment, and decisions and action that we need, but also perhaps working backwards. How do we use the understanding and commitment we need to actually decide what data we need and what modeling we make? So of course, this isn't just a one-way process. And within all of this, what are we trying to do in bringing stakeholder processes and experts and modelers together to think about this? And I know Keith and the others on the panel will have a lot to say about this. Maybe just the next one. So just to remind you, perhaps if you didn't join us last week, or to refresh, through the Foresight process, we've been basically thinking about 7 steps, which broadly is working with stakeholders, thinking about how we map the system, looking at big long-term trends and uncertainties, which helps to build the scenarios, and then flowing all that through into the implications for thinking about systems change. Next bit. Yeah. And through that, looking at how we can bring the sort of stakeholder participation into all of that, gaining multiple perspectives, using a whole range of different participatory tools, but that only works if we can underpin that with the next bit. Yes, Bram, with the evidence base. So what's the evidence base that we can use to underpin this foresight and scenario thinking? So that's essentially the kickoff. Not next week, the week after in Montpellier, and I'm sure many of you online may be joining us in Montpellier. We're going to have a much deeper discussion around these sorts of issues, and particularly what this means for supporting foresight and scenario processes at the national level. So today is really a bit of a kickoff for the more in-depth discussion we're hoping to have in Montpellier in 2 weeks' time. So I think that's all I need to say, Bram. Thanks very much, and thanks everybody for joining us, and we look forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot for that brief introduction, Jim. And indeed, that sort of gives a bit of an overview of what we're working on and what we're thinking about in terms of foresight, and also giving some brief sort of seeds that we can use as we move into the panel discussion as well. I just want to add, by the way, that if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, feel free to add those in the chat. And of course, we'll try to bring that back into the discussion. But of course, we can save those until those breakout groups are taking place. So the panel discussion, I'd like to invite Keith and Saeed and Monica to have a look at some of these questions. We'll be doing 2 rounds, basically. The first round is more or less asking you all the general question, which is, where are we at in terms of integrating participatory processes or stakeholder-focused processes and quantitative modeling to support foresight for food system change. And you've all 3 of you have been working in the foresight domain for a very long time. And I think you've all have your perspective on this. And maybe you can briefly also add with your reflections what you consider the biggest challenges, or the biggest challenge or the biggest opportunities that you will that you've also seen so far. We'll start with that, and then we'll go into the second round. Maybe can I ask Keith, would you be willing to break the ice, so to say?
Sure. Thanks, Bram, and thanks, Jim, for inviting me back. Yeah, really happy to participate in this discussion, and it's a very important topic, a very challenging and complicated one, but one that, as Jim mentioned, in the case of Kenya, and certainly in all of our own situations, we are experiencing changes in food systems that are really get to critical issues for each of us individually, as well as at multiple scales, all the way up to the global scale. So on this particular question of engagement and modeling, or engagement and analysis more broadly, I think in my mind, a couple of points. One is that these, sometimes they're seen as competing approaches. I think that's one thing we really need to move beyond, and we are moving beyond. They really are fundamentally complementary. Either one alone is going to lack something important that the other one can bring. And within each of those two, they're also, they're not single, clearly defined approaches either. There's a whole range of different engagement approaches depending on what the issue is and who the stakeholders are, and what the particular question is that's motivating a foresight exercise. And likewise, on the side of analytical tools, and even in the case of models specifically, there's a huge variety of different tools. And in fact, modeling, which is the area that my group does quite a bit of work in, is itself covers a wide range of things. And indeed, it's not just simulation models, which is what some people think of, but when you work with data, if you're doing statistical analysis, that also involves models, meaning assumptions about how you approach the data. And pretty much everything we do on a daily basis. If you took an umbrella to work this morning, you're operating with a mental model that says, well, what if something happens? What do I need to do in order to be prepared? And sometimes those are completely unconscious processes that we employ in order to approach things that we deal with on a daily basis. Food systems are different because they're tremendously more complicated, and they involve, in one sense, 8 billion stakeholders. All of us are stakeholders in food systems. And so to me, well, the mix of tools, the mix of approaches really depends on the purpose and what's motivating a particular exercise. So that's one note. I would say in terms of challenge, it really is the complexity of the issues that we confront when we talk about food systems. Not only how many people are involved, but how many layers and how many concerns and dimensions that are relevant. It's we make choices about what we eat based on our preferences, based on our cultural background, based on nutritional considerations, but then increasingly also environmental considerations. What impact does this have on my local area, on different parts of the globe, on the other side of the earth, and so forth. So that complexity is really a fundamental challenge. On the opportunity side, I would just say very generally that there's such a huge interest in this area now that I think there have been people working on foresight for a long time, but I think there was a sense for a long time that there wasn't enough appreciation or recognition for the importance. And I think more and more it's unfortunate. It's being driven by the big concerns that we face. But if we can see it as an opportunity, there is a lot more interest in approaching this thoughtfully, and that's something that opens a door for better foresight work. Thanks.
Yeah, really nice reflections, and I think that also has plenty of sort of hooks where we can dive into a little bit later as we move into the discussion. So indeed, the complexity. But at the same time, the huge number of new ways of thinking that have really been coming up in the past couple of years are very interesting, and the interest in that is really increasing. Saeed, can I ask you what you think about this question and indeed the opportunity and the challenge that you see?
Hi, okay, thank you for inviting me. I take it from what Kate said about that these two methods actually are fundamentally complementary. I would say even naturally complementary. And basically what you can actually, traditionally the qualitative work actually is supposed to stretch perspective and basically expose participants' assumptions about the future. And models actually the focus of mainly of understanding of this complexity, and sometimes in some cases also projecting system dynamics, but they can actually, they can easily reinforce the strength of each other. And the challenge is also sometimes, lies there because, when we, because sometimes we are dealing with even, some problems with the internal stakeholders being the qualitative part of the quantitative part. So, I mean, ideally, the qualitative part lays the groundwork to focus and basically bring the focus to the quantitative simulation and key system dynamics, rather than, for the quantification to go all over the place. But the challenge is the disconnect. Sometimes, you really have some sort of this disconnect between these two. And it really, sometimes it's really difficult. It takes a lot of time, and based on the experience, I'm saying, takes a lot of time actually to bring these two groups together to actually see how these two actually can actually work in that respect, getting from that groundwork of qualitative work to the focus of a quantitative work. The second one is models can produce complex relationship, which basically are not necessarily foreseen in the qualitative part, and also explore, especially explicit, which are really sometimes left out from the qualitative work. But challenge there is, of course, the data, because getting from what has been actually done in terms of qualitative narratives to basically tackle those in terms of the modeling data is always a big issue. And there's also another thing, which basically there's challenges come with the project structure, that you always say, okay, so I want the participatory work actually inform the models, but then you never actually have the time to feed it back, because if you feed it back, it allows for the identification of surprising dynamics which we get from the models. You didn't think about it. You can actually verify internal consistency of qualitative narratives, which basically the assumptions you make. And then you can also test some policies and strategies or specific actions. But of course, another challenge which actually lies here is, validation of the models, how we can actually believe. And of course, models also kind of a representation of the real world with certain strong assumptions, which sometimes has nothing to do with the actual reality. So this is also another thing which I see. In terms of opportunities, and I'm going to finish here, in terms of opportunities, I mean, Kate mentioned that, if you look, we have a very good value proposition right now, because on the demand side, the policymakers now actually, next to the qualitative work, prefer also an addition of quantitative, often also especially explicit representation of the impacts which are hypothesized in qualitative narratives. And they also want tools for simulating the outcomes. From the supply side, I also see more and more that many participatory workshops has kind of transitions from raising only, for example, food system literacy, also to informing specific planning and management decisions, like the DACA food agenda. So basically, this is a big opportunity, and very good opportunity, both from the supply side and demand side, actually bring these two together. And as I said, they are naturally complementary.
Yeah, thanks, Saeed. I think very rich reflections already. And I think you're pointing out to also sort of how sort of the people who are doing the quantitative and the qualitative work can be working together to indeed really get this complementarity out, and to get it also so that indeed other stakeholders can use this in an effective way. And then you're especially referring to decision makers as well, who are indeed very interested in this kind of process. Moving to Monica, can you maybe add a little bit your perspective? And I can imagine you're coming more from the qualitative side, but also listening to what Keith and Saeed have been saying. What do you want to add to this in terms of opportunities and challenges?
Yes, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak on that, which is a topic that I find fascinating and absolutely needed in producing scenario work and also wider foresight work that is both relevant as well as evidence-based as much as that's possible. So here I would just really concur with Keith and with Saeed, saying that the qualitative and the quantitative approach, they can be used on their own for different purposes, but I think they are really complementary with each other and can really strengthen the use and the so to say, the usability of particular scenarios in a lot of different settings. I think what for me here is very important is that it's clear what the purpose of the actual exercise is and what the purpose of using the two different approaches, either separately or jointly, is in a particular exercise. So one of the strengths that I see in the qualitative scenario building is really that exploration of assumptions and drawing these out, different assumptions that stakeholders hold in their head, the mental models that people base their decisions on. And that's often not straightforward, because a whole bunch of these assumptions are actually sometimes not even clearly voiced by the particular stakeholder, but they arise in the discussions and in the, so to say, asking questions from each other in participatory stakeholder workshops. And I think this is a really important part that that can then help to spell out and understand different perspectives that stakeholders hold about the future, which is, so to say, not that easy to do if you have a quantitative modeling approach, just because there the assumptions are to a certain extent given by the model setup. And so one really important challenge I see here in integrating the two is understanding the assumptions that are made in the model and understanding the assumptions that are made by stakeholders, and how much do they map or agree with each other, so that you can actually really integrate. So that discussion needs to be had between the people running the participatory exercises and the modelers, in order to really make the two approaches complement each other and not cancel each other out, which I think can also happen, because the other bit I've sometimes seen in terms of a challenge is that that understanding what happens on the modeling side is not a straightforward issue for a lot of stakeholders, neither for people like me, qualitative scenario people. So then making sure that we're using the right models in order to basically bring the best of data and evidence as possible into the future's world is also a really important challenge that I think we need to be a bit more explicit or more open about, to explore, and also be open about, okay, to say this kind of model might be able to do X, but is that the right model that we need here to explore the assumptions that stakeholders bring to the table? But at the same time, as was mentioned earlier, the quantitative side can bring in a rigor and an internal consistency check that is sometimes easily lost in participatory processes. And so bringing out the best of both worlds is really where I see a lot of opportunity for basically improving joint scenario processes using qualitative and quantitative methods. So let me stop here.
Thanks, Monica. I mean, that's really nice way of indeed tapping into what Keith and Said were saying, indeed also in highlighting the need for sort of questioning assumptions, and also indeed looking closely at purpose of why you're sort of, for instance, combining different approaches as well. Yeah. And I think also highlighting that it's important to share how the process takes place. Exactly. And indeed, so that it's becoming more clear, like how do these models, for instance, how are they developed, and indeed, what can they do, and maybe what can't they do? Yeah. So that's really, really good reflections already. Maybe just to step a little bit back before we dive into more discussions, I think some questions are coming up in the chat already. But I'd like to also now give a bit of space to Keith and Said to share a few things about what they're doing on this topic. And before I do that, I'd like to ask my colleague moderator, Ratana Po, to join me here on the screen. Ratana and I are co-moderating this session together, and I'm very happy that she's logged in now with us. Ratana is working on climate and climate resilient agri-food systems in Asia with UN FAO. And I think you're in a car, Ratana. Can you hear and say something?
Yes, I can hear you very well, and it was very interesting discussion. Sorry, I'm still be moving. My flight was delayed. Yeah, we co-moderating. It was very interesting coming from the three speakers. I think we get into that second round, and I think like the emphasis of creating this room where modeling team or modeling tool can talk as well with the quantitative aspect is coming very strongly, understanding as well the scope of the work, why we're doing that. But I really want to push a little bit more the speaker here. Most of those work or those recommendations, the foresight analytic that is coming out of it is for decision making. Or we are aiming for better decision making. And with your experience over the last 10 years or 20 years in so many different countries that have a limited or very low data governance, how do we ensure that there are actually decision making that is being taken? And how do we ensure that we are building through that process as well a better understanding of what should be data governance?
Yeah,
that's
really good questions already. I think there's a lot there, and maybe let's give the speakers a chance to chew on that a bit while I share my screen, so that Keith can start off with sharing a little bit what he's doing, and then we'll come back to this question to see if we can get a little bit further in that discussion as well. So let me share my screen again. There we go. Keith, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I'd just like to spend a couple minutes here talking about a new CGIAR initiative on foresight and metrics, which is specifically designed to help address some of these complex challenges. You can move right ahead to the next slide, Bram. So this is a slide some of you may have seen, and Monica, thanks, you may recall, we worked on this together a few years ago, but it's about this idea of foresight being a process, and not just a process, but an iterative, an ongoing process that involves different steps. And this, in a way, echoes some of the things that we saw in Jim's slide a few moments ago, but I wanted to emphasize the point that these really do sort of cycle, and Jim alluded to that as well, in terms of moving in one direction as well as moving back in another direction. And yeah, just to note that first of all, looking at the circle on the left-hand side, the process involves dialogue. It involves thinking about the future. The green boxes are sort of generic steps. The yellow boxes are elements that can inform those different pieces. And so I've noted stakeholder engagement up at the top near the dialogue box. It actually permeates all of the boxes in different degrees. Visioning is certainly a collective exercise where we think about what are the future, what is the future we'd like to achieve, what are the types of futures that we'd like to avoid. For example, on the left, questions are often triggered by scanning the horizon to understand big trends that may be emerging, some of them expected and slow moving, some of them unexpected and very rapidly evolving. And then at the bottom of this particular cycle is a step of analyzing impacts that, again, may involve a wide range of approaches, different degrees of sort of quantitative complexity, but there isn't necessarily a direct relationship between more complicated being better. It all depends on the question and the issue that is being addressed. One very consistent pattern that we have found in our experience is this link between the analyzing impacts at the bottom and the confronting questions on the left. I often picture the process as starting with the questions on the left, and that's triggered by things like looking at the horizon and seeing emerging trends. But we come back to the questions, and always come back to questions after the analysis. This echoes things that Said said and things that Monica have said already, which is, you know, whatever type of analysis you employ, that can help check for consistency. It can help reveal unexpected impacts, but it always raises questions. what assumptions did we make in order to reach particular conclusions? And so that's a really important part of the process. And that, it is time consuming, but time has to be built in order to confront that. And that's also why this is an iterative process, because then, you don't necessarily stop there. You decide, are these questions significant enough that we need to go back and change our assumptions and do the analysis again, or modify it in some way? Or are we satisfied, having examined those assumptions, that we agree that you're moving a little fast, Bram, sorry, that we are comfortable with those assumptions, and therefore we have confidence in the findings that came from them. Finally, over on the right-hand side of this graph is where the decision-making comes out. It doesn't come out of the analysis. The analysis can inform the decision-making, but the choices are made, again, in some sort of process of engagement, whether that's, who those stakeholders are. We can get into all kinds of debate about whether they are, sufficiently representative or whatever. But in the end, there are decision makers who will draw on evidence. Some of it may come from the analysis. It always comes from many other factors as well, political considerations and historical experience and momentum and inertia and all those kinds of things, eventually feeding into prioritization choices. And then, of course, there's an obligation or a responsibility to look at the impacts of those choices and revisit it for the future. So this is just a very generic sort of summary of the importance of considering this as a process. Now to the next slide, please. In the case of the CG Foresight initiative, this diagram loosely follows a similar sort of cycle that involves engagement. It involves improvements in capacity, as well as making tools accessible. And the point of that is we want to do the analysis jointly with partners in the country, not as something that's externally produced and brought in to say, here are something that we hope is useful, but it's growing out of the needs of participants and partners in the country, and is done jointly with them, so they understand it. They have a stronger sense of ownership and relevance, and then that feeds into different types of analysis. And one more click, Bram. Just a few examples of things that are happening in each of these stages. We recently had a very constructive Foresight Partnership Forum with partners. It was hosted in Nairobi, but with partners from 16 countries across Africa. And these are institutions I'll talk about in a moment on the next slide that are involved in informing decision-making in their respective countries. And over on the left, already some examples of types of analyses that are coming out of this work. Some of it looking in the near term at impacts of the conflict in Ukraine on food and fuel and fertilizer prices in many developing countries, in turn on indicators like poverty and food security and so forth. And also reflecting more broadly on some of the big drivers that are expected to affect food systems in Eastern and Southern Africa, for example. And then the last slide, please. So finally, in order, these issues are complicated. Institutionally, it's really important to think about where we can have an impact in terms of informing decision-making. In our case, that choice is to focus on national level decision-making in conjunction with partner institutions in countries that are already engaged in policy dialogue with decision makers, and also with development partners, funder agencies and others who interact and support some of the work that's being done. And our particular focus, we do analysis from the whole range of scales, from global down to subnational, but with a particular focus on Eastern, Southern Africa and South Asia, and a few particular focus countries where we have more in-depth policy engagement in addition to analytical work. So that's just a real quick summary. Happy to respond to questions or follow up more if people are interested. Thanks, Bram.
Thanks a lot for that, Keith. And I think very interesting work. I think you already shared that in the previous webinar as well, but I think there's so many different things that we can also tap into here in terms of expertise, also on different levels as well. And I can imagine people have questions about that, how it works on global, regional, and national level. So let's hope we get into that as well. Maybe then just also keeping the speed going with the cases, I'd like to welcome Said to also, on behalf of the Wageningen Economic Research team, to also chip in, indeed with a specific example of your work that you're doing in Dhaka, in Bangladesh. I know Jim has already promoted that work in the previous webinar as well. And I think this is a very nice example of indeed combining qualitative and quantitative methods. So go ahead.
Sure. Okay, thank you. So yeah, it's a very specific example compared to what Kate presented. So this is a part of the project. Is a large project. It's a collaboration between the embassy of the Netherlands in Bangladesh, Wageningen University, and FAO in Dhaka. So next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. So basically, a part of the project is actually working at the long-term intervention strategies for food system planning and governance. The unique thing about what we did actually in Dhaka, which was really, I remember when I was in a kickoff meeting, and we were talking about using national models. There were lots of criticism because this is really about urban food system planning. So it's really sub-national. And restricted to Dhaka metropolitan area. So the idea of this this part of the work was to come up with the foresight and scenario planning and modeling. And this, as I mentioned before, was really directed to a very specific plan, which is the formulating Dhaka Food Agenda 2041, which is an important year, is the end of the one of the 5-year plan in Bangladesh. And this is the year where they think the Bangladeshis actually, based on the projection, think that they are going to get to this move from the low-income country, middle-income country, and after that, also establishing the Dhaka metropolitan area consultative group, which is supposed to be very representative of different stakeholders. And the last step is training and capacity building. Next slide, please. Okay, so we actually use the 7 steps, which was already presented maybe in a few occasions, and also today by Jim. And if you look at the modeling, actually it happens from the moment that we have constructed those narratives or scenarios to actually get to the SS applications. And of course, what we want to do here is a little bit understanding of the dynamics and also projections of different possible futures towards the 2041, which basically is the impact year of what we actually setting up here. Next slide. Yeah. Okay. So what we actually do. First step is, of course, we have to, there was a framework, we came up with scenarios, and then of course that needed to be quantified, what are the main drivers, and the difficulty is actually you want to put this, the urban food planning and the Dhaka metropolitan area into the bigger perspective of this national or country level drivers and dynamics, because of course the production is mainly coming from the outside of Dhaka, not inside the Dhaka. So you have to zoom in and zoom out, and again zoom in again in order to be able to do that. And that was really unique and very challenging. We're not yet there, but I think we also learned a lot of lessons. And of course, the simulation of the trade-off and synergies. If you really want. So for example, if they had some sort of initiative about the waste collection in Dhaka, and the idea is, green waste is a really big issue in wet markets and in the Dhaka city. Now, of course, if they really want to plan for something in the future, saying that 2041, given that the diet is actually changing, income is changing as a result of that, probably diet is also going to be influenced. And so they're gonna most probably they're gonna face a different type of problems in 2041 compared to today. So that was really kind of interesting to actually kind of only just to try to stretch a little bit of flex, participants thinking about the future. Next slide, please. So for example, the narrative says, okay, consumption patterns, a diet with more meat, probably kind of a Western diet. one of the challenges was, okay, what does that mean, more meat? 20% more, or maybe 60 grams per person per day. So these are the challenges we had to face. You know, what do we mean by more? But then, of course, what comes out also is very interesting to feed back to the initial narratives. Okay, healthier diet probably means less malnutrition decreases by 7%. But then there is environmental degradation in terms of, you know, the natural area lost to grazing land. So, for example, that type of thing, which you can feed back to the initial narrative, which you really didn't think about it. Or if this Bangladesh has actually the production capacity, if we really want to go to more healthier diet, can Bangladesh actually produce what is required in terms of different food groups? Or if not, what about the trade? And then you actually get to the bigger picture. What about the impact of climate change on production? So these type of things which you can actually feed back to the discussion. Next slide, please. And of course, yeah, so the whole idea is actually now with all this information, how we can design an adaptive plan and also include into discussion what is the preferred pathways and what are the triggers, you know, how we can actually trigger those pathways. Next one, please. Okay, so I don't want to go to details of the modeling we actually did, but I thought it would be interesting because this is also about the modeling a quantitative approach. There actually we actually focus on a kind of a structural demand supply model of the global economy. But then, of course, from the global economy, we had to actually use a couple of drivers like, okay, the population is changing, diet is changing, the income, the GDP is actually increasing. So these are, so basically there will be, on the supply side, there will be some productivity shock in terms of, for example, technical change or impact of climate change. And then, of course, there's some trade scenarios in future. So if you actually take that into account, you know, what is the future of the production of consumption of different food groups in Bangladesh? And of course, you know, what is important in the end, we have to zoom in back again to the district level in Bangladesh and also Dhaka district and even in metropolitan areas. So we use that micro simulation model, which actually look at the income and poverty projection maps. So for that, we actually use some national level indicators like wages and food prices projections next to household survey, and then from there we actually get to the per capita food nutrition projections, and also, of course, from this global income and demographic changes, we have to get to the subnational benchmark, and then from there we actually get to this special iterative ways actually to eventually get to the simulation of the per capita and income and food nutrition security at the level we actually wanted. So basically, we use different approaches in order to meet the objectives of the project. Then next slide, please. And so basically, what we did, this is still a
sorry, Said. Let me just briefly. Sorry, can you please mute? Thank you. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
So yeah, I mean, the result, and I hope that we can actually, we'll have more time, we're still work in progress, to detail this a little bit more in Montpellier. It's actually a web-based interactive dashboard. And I'm not going to go through the results, but then you can actually interactive in a sense that you can actually play a little bit with the type of indicator and different aspects of the dimension of indicators you want to see. And then on the left-hand side is more like national in terms of national figures in terms of consumption production. trade, and on the right side, actually, you see, what does that mean in terms of poverty, food access, food and nutrition security, malnutrition, etc. at the level of the district level in Bangladesh, and also especially for the metropolitan area. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Said. And I think it's a really nice example of indeed putting to practice these kind of approaches and try to see how you can work through also developing, how to practically work with these data sets at a very focused national, local level, you might say. So thanks for sharing that. Maybe just bringing Ratana's question into this as well, and try to think about, maybe Ratana, you can repeat your question a little bit again, so the speakers can respond to it, also based indeed on their presentations.
Yes, sure. I think I will divide it then directly into two questions. The first one really about the next user, so that decision making that we are trying to trigger. It is more and more urgent in the food system. It needs to be more and more robust, and it needs to be at multiple scale. How do we do that effectively? What has been tool in the different projects that have been demonstrating that we are not only communicating those data, but we're going beyond, we are accelerating decision making. So that's my first question, sorry. Kate, I can see that you, Monica, please.
Shall I go ahead? Well, Monica, go ahead.
Yes, Monica.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And let me directly jump into that question, because this is actually an area where I think the qualitative side of scenario development can be very powerful, especially if linked well with quantitative modeling. But let's, so to say, by the qualitative side, in a scenario process. The reason I'm saying that what the qualitative process in a scenario exercise can really do is draw out, as I said earlier, a lot of these assumptions, but also learn from each other about assumptions that different people hold, and also question some of these assumptions, both through some of the rigor that modeling can bring to the table, but also through some of the questions that other stakeholders seeing the world very different might have in a process. Yeah, but that engagement with the stakeholders, and also creating ownership over some of the potential scenarios that are explored. To my mind, for that, you really need participatory processes, and you need participatory scenario building that can then, combined with the quantification in models, to bring in the internal consistency and so on and so forth, the more evidence-based side, can actually learning processes about maybe rethinking some of these assumptions, maybe redrawing some of the mental maps on which we base a lot of our decisions. And this is where I really see the strength of combining qualitative and quantitative methods in some of the projects that I've been working in. But yeah, Keith, jump in with more ideas about the whole decision-making bit and scenarios.
Well, it broadly echoes what you said, Monica. I would just add that element of engagement and ownership is also critical in the quantitative. The quantitative and the modeling doesn't, it's not something that happens separately or externally. It can, it sometimes does, and sometimes that's appropriate and sufficient. But in terms of informing national level policymaking, it's not sufficient. And that's why we build in not just the capacity strengthening, the improved access and transparency of tools, but the actual joint participation in analysis, because that draws in some of what you've mentioned, Monica, in terms of understanding relevance and questioning assumptions and so forth, but also in ownership of, understanding of the analysis and ownership of the results then. because they were jointly produced and because they were informed by questions that come from the decision makers in the first place. I think it was Saeed who said earlier, they're time-consuming processes, and that's often the challenge. Either, you know, whether you're talking about the engagement or the analytical side, both of them are already. But that's just one of the challenges that we have to confront in order to, and I would say, enhance uptake. We can't ensure uptake ultimately, but we can enhance it, and we can try and make it as useful and relevant and owned as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. And I think it is very important to bring as well the time factor into that decision making. I would like to hear a little bit more with Saeed, because you bring as well these points about this feedback loop. So while we're doing the quantitative and the qualitative, you have that feedback loop where things are changing, where people are taking new type of decision, thinking the world in different view as well. How do you create that space, and what kind of skill are kind of required? Is it really the role still of the researcher here, or is it something that need to be somehow hand over as well?
I mean, I should be honest that we haven't really got to that point in DACA food system project, but this is what I think it should happen. It's, as I said, I mean, you have to when you actually kind of make planning for stakeholder engagement, you have to always come up with two plans. One is external stakeholder, the other one internal stakeholder. So you really have to, from the beginning of the project, actually make sure that internally you can actually have this dialogue and we be able to have this discussion. In other projects, actually, it was really a time-consuming part of the project. We have had that with Monica Zero Hunger, Zero Emission with CCAFs. You have to really to go back and forth in order to get this sort of collaboration internally. And sometimes, it's difficult because as I said, I mean, you have a lot of degrees of freedom in the qualitative work. And basically, it's much less in a quantitative work, when sometimes really it is difficult to actually get to this common ground where basically you can have this type of work. But at least you have to have some sort of a minimum type of basically intersection there in order to be able to make sure that this integration is happening, and it's not like they're treated as like two separate thing. And then I would like to also emphasize on a point which was mentioned, and this creating of ownership. This is also very important that you start right in the beginning of a project. I mean, I've been involved in Bangladesh in 2 different projects. DACA food system is one now. With the sense of ownership, we have now 2 problems. One is basically we are at the end phase of the project, and the ownership has become a problem right now. I was in another project in which basically we actually did a better job. They're engaging, experts and stakeholders from the beginning of the project. They were in the back seat, we were in the front seat. And then in the last year of the project, we actually changed seats. So they were in the front seat, they were using the models, they were going to the stakeholder workshops. They were the real owner, and then we were in the back seat. And that actually was a better experience compared to the project, where basically you start thinking about the ownership really towards the end of the project. And the other issue is, I think Jim also mentioned it in another meeting, or maybe it was a webinar, that the data, the prime example in Bangladesh is the food system dashboard. It's a simple dashboard to actually show some indicators. It's not really modeling. It's simply just aggregating data, come up with indicators. But they also had difficulty to actually sell it to the policymakers in Bangladesh, because they were saying every data which doesn't come from the statistical Bureau of Statistics in Bangladesh, we cannot really validate it. So I think it's also very important that, you know, in terms of data that or modeling or validation of the modeling data, to be engaged with and really well connected to the authority in that country in order to make sure that at the end the modeling outcomes or this type of dashboard are going to be used.
Thank you, Said, and thank you for bringing as well the data part and the data governance. I see the hands of Jim. Jim, would you like to share your comments or your questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect briefly on the link between the sort of modeling participatory processes and policy influencing. And, you know, in a sense, based on the discussion we've been having in the workshop here today, where, you know, people were saying, you know, one, we've got a whole lot of policies, they're often not implemented, but B, perhaps some of the policies we need to make a strategic change in the system are really hard to get in place. And that led to a discussion of saying, actually, what you need to be doing is to get alliances of different stakeholders that are then working with government to, you know, I guess, basically put pressure on government. And so I think when we're talking about how all of this is used, it's not only trying to influence government policy, but helping to create the understanding across a broad base of stakeholders and helping to support the different sort of alliances that can end up helping to create some of that societal pressure to bring about change. And I think that's a really important thing to think about, particularly in the context of the whole movement we've had around the dialogues on food systems change.
Yeah, really nice discussions, and I think some really good insights already being shared. Let me move to the next part of this discussion. I think we also wanted to have the opportunity for different participants who are in the room and who also have a lot of experience, a lot of them with Foresight initiatives. So what I'd like to propose is that you will get a pop-up to join one of 3 breakout rooms. And basically, I suggest that Keith, you select number 1, Said number 2, and then Monica number 3. And then basically participants can sort of select which rooms they want to join and have a brief discussion of about, say, 10, 11 minutes, just reflecting a little bit of what you've heard, maybe sharing a little bit about what you're doing. And then we come back again to the main plenary, and then we hear a few pickings from what you've discussed. But then I hope that we also get a chance to hear from you. So Arfa, can I ask you to let the rooms open and let people select? All groups, please come back with at least one sort of reflection and one critical question that you still have or that comes up in your discussion.
Sorry, Bram, which room should I choose? What was your
2.
2, okay.
Yeah, and then Monica 3 and Keith 1. All right. So let's see if the rooms are popping up now. Hope it works. This is a bit of an experiment, of course.
Yeah, I've opened up. Bram, you're in the room 1, and Jim as well. Said, you are in the room 2 already. And Monica is in room 3. And Keith as well.
Okay, well, we shuffle it a bit. That's fine.
Can you see the pop-up, all of you?
No.
Okay.
Not yet.
Oh, now we are.
All right. Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.
Marlene, are you there? Give a sign of life if you're there. Otherwise, we continue.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can't see you, but we can hear you.
Okay, yeah, my camera is broken. I'm sorry about that. And my name is Milena. I participated in the Africa Foresight Systems series of webinars just late last year. And I actually had the chance to work in environmentally funded EU projects, IFPRI specifically. And so my interest is definitely in Foresight and the link to environmental systems, and currently looking for a job. So I just had to put that out there. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, who knows? Yeah.
And I live in Bonn, Germany. Just, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
And also nice to bring in that environmental perspective. So thank you. So yeah, this room is up to us. Does anyone want to already go ahead and share some insight or some reflection from the discussion of what you heard just now, or maybe something new that you want to contribute, or maybe a question you want to ask? Feel free to step in. John.
May
kick it
I
off.
may
Yeah.
I just start this off?
Oh, just when he started, the connection was lost, I think.
In Foresight as an exercise and the value that brings. Just a general question, though, given the introduction Jim made about the issues facing today in Kenya and other parts of the world, to what degree does Foresight thinking actually help with managing the issues of today as well as planning for the future?
Yeah. So does anyone want to respond? Maybe some people from the countries where a lot of this work is maybe very relevant. Maybe
Be very
Lei or
interested
Rodney
to hear
or
from
Mihaela?
yeah.
Well, I'll rather give room for others to respond and maybe
No,
later.
please go ahead. If you have
Please,
if you
I'd
have
be
a
very
response, go
interested.
ahead. For now, I would because I have a couple of things to say. I'll save my thought until maybe others respond. Then I'll be able to share my own experience.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Anyone else who would like to chip in and respond maybe to the question of John? Maybe Mihaela, you want to share some
Yes.
thoughts?
It's a very general question. It kind of answers for itself, you know. In order to know what to do today, you need to think about the future a lot and have it on your mind all the time. And we have such tools as Foresight, such tools as modeling-based forecasts or modeling-based simulations. But what I think it's a great challenge is that they both face quite a similar drama. They find themselves very hard to be understood by commissioners and by stakeholders. The tools, because they are not such a common sense issue, you know, they are still something special. There is not, let's say, global future literacy interest to make these tools more democratic, to engage them in general education. There are some sophisticated tools used by decision makers. So they find themselves very, very hard to be translated. Yes, both forecasting and foresight. So what is very interesting here in the issue of stakeholders engaged in your process is that you have to kind of educate, make them learn all the time. So just to offer my answer to the previous discussions, I would say that it's the continuous commitment you need to be very focused on. You need to engage them so much during the process that they become committed to the process. And you always have to, you know, be careful what exactly are your wishes so you won't get frustrated, because there are tangible and intangible results, and you can measure some, but you can't measure others. But you might do something there in the intangible aspects of the foresight process. And you can do that with qualitative, with interaction, with creativity, and with let's say, collaborative processes. And also just to say, maybe I won't have the time to talk later on, Foresight Future Studies is concerned with the issue of assumptions. So there are, the merge between future studies and anticipatory science has a focus on identifying assumptions and challenging assumptions and rediscussing them. So this is, but it's a very, very niche thing that is rarely done so far. I'm going to stop now.
Thanks, Mihaela. Really nice comments, and really nice to see that you're really into this topic, I think, as an expert as well. So really good to know. Maybe just to give the word to some other people we've not heard from yet. Maybe Mylène, you want to share some perspective what you heard so far, what you find interesting?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Maybe just a key point that comes to mind as this question about whether foresight thinking is really helping is my experience with the EU funded projects. These were short-term 3-4 year projects. I actually have written about them in my doctoral thesis that I'm currently completing. And what strikes me is the lack of awareness, in fact, and the lack of openness to participatory methods. It's quite a challenge, in fact, when you're introducing certain ways of working, especially participatory ways, to people who, while they went through university, didn't necessarily see the essence of such methods because maybe they were purely focused on their quantitative work. And so I think we are at a stage where among us we see the relevance, and it's definitely we are definitely propagating it as much as we can, but externally it's surprising how quickly you're in very important spheres, because these are research and innovation funds. So these are very important spheres to influence decision making, for example, and change in countries. And yet yeah, the experience can be quite challenging with regards to just participatory ways to pursue research. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, really nice experience on also your personal work in your project. Yeah. Let's see. We probably only have a few minutes left. So Lei, I know you wanted to say something, so let's hear from you.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I decided to save my thoughts up till this moment. Well, for us in Nigeria and where I work particularly, the use of foresight has actually is at the infant stages, because I recall after attending a program in Pakistan on foresight, I had to bring that back home to see how it could really be utilized in some of the projects. Unfortunately, there are several factors, external, internal, but we found out that those factors that are external, they have more influence than those that are internal. And people, I don't know, for obvious reasons, will tend to dump some of those methods or some of those tools and change. They prefer to continue with the old self rather than continue to use Foresight for futuristic studies. We're still on, and we're still pushing ahead, and we hope probably it's going to be widespread, because well, for us it's like Nela said, it's quite challenging for me because I know it's good for us, and I've been pushing inward so that some of my colleagues could buy or my employers could buy into it. Well, I must tell you, it's really challenging, and it's difficult to really get inroad into it. In a nutshell, that's all I have to say, but I still believe this is a tool that is a tool for now, is a tool for the future for us, and we think that could be of help. Thank you.
Nice, thank you, Lei. And maybe the circle is a little bit round. John, you asked about, what's the value of food system foresight now and in the future? And I think Lei is definitely one of those proponents who say it is valuable.
Right. Sure. Yeah, I was, it just occurred to me as we've been listening to the presentations, because so much of the work I've been involved in is about the uncertainties and the assumptions of the future. The question in my mind was, how does that style of thinking actually help manage the problems of today? So is it a way of a new way of thinking about issues? Is it a way of defining the boundaries which would help with today's challenge, as well as what's, as Jim says, coming down the pipe in the future? I'm conscious that so much of the concerns and the management issues of policy makers in public and private sector is today's challenge. How do we get out of the problem now? Anyway, that's what I was getting at. Jim's got his hand up, and then Mihaela.
I think the room's closing now, so maybe Jim,
Oh, is it?
a few words. Thanks, everyone. Welcome back. I see group 1 has returned. That's great. The other groups are now, I think, coming into this room soon. Thanks for the discussions we've had so far. I think there's more to be said, and I think, obviously, this is maybe just a kickstart to some of your discussions, and we've not been able to satisfactorily answer all questions. Thank you so much for engaging, and I hope all the different groups had at least a bit of a fruitful discussion to chew on in the moment forward. Jim, can I ask you to maybe in 1 minute sort of sketch a little bit the way forward of how you see it?
You're on mute. Jim, sorry, you're on mute.
I think
I fear Jim was having some internet trouble in group 1, and that may still be persisting. I don't know where.
Oh yeah,
No
yeah,
sign of him. Yeah.
Must be. Good. So yeah, then maybe or maybe John, you want to say something about the way forward? Why not?
Well, indeed. I mean, in addition to the next webinar, which I hope you'll join, and Bram gave us a head up on that. I really see the tremendous value that we've been discussing, not only in this series, but in the whole process of foresight development. And it is it's not a finished exercise. There isn't a standard way to do it. And I think all of your interest and expertise is part of the networking activity that Foresight4food is really interested in drawing on, to explore different approaches, to see what works in what context, in what time frame. A little discussion we had in our breakout group was the value of foresight thinking for handling the challenges of today as well as the challenges of tomorrow. And so areas such as boundary setting and thinking about drivers, looking at trends, all help with assessing problems today as well as in the future. And I do think, therefore, it's got double value in that regard. Not much more I can say. I don't know what Jim was imagining he was going to say, but all I can say is thanks for being part of this. Thanks to the speakers today. It's an ongoing activity. Please stay engaged with Foresight4food. It's important that you do, because without the community of practice, it is nothing. And so I hope that it's value and that you'll be able to join the seminar series and indeed all other activities. Bram, I don't know what else to say right now, but it's a plea to stay engaged.
Well spoken. Nothing to add besides, please sign up for our newsletter. We'll be having a new one coming out. We'll be having a Montpellier workshop very soon. We'll be sharing the insights there and also in the webinars to come. And we hope to develop more interesting initiative with you the coming year. So thanks, everyone. Thanks to the speakers. Thanks to Ratana for co-moderating. Monica for stepping in particularly. Thank you so much, and hope to see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Okay, bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Bye.